What's going on, guys, and welcome to a new episode of Athena Optimize. So in this video, I want to talk about concentration, learning your first programming language or even just a new programming language, and the mind. So what I noticed from sitting down for hours and hours and hours and trying to learn new programming languages is that your concentration will be tested. Do not get me wrong. It will be tested, especially if you're going through a method of learning that just isn't very compelling. Like, if you don't know how to study, you're going to have a tough time learning. It's just tough if you don't know how to study. And learning how to study is a skill just like any other. And a lot of people, shy away from harder topics because they think, oh, I just don't have the capacity for it. But the truth is that you probably just don't have the skill. Like, do you even know that learning is itself a skill? If you don't know how to learn, then guess what? Learning is going to suck, and it's going to be miserable, and it's going to be boring. And even if you do know how to learn, there are some times where it can seem a little bit miserable or a little bit boring, and that's normal. That's part of life, and I think that you need to figure out ways to just deal with it. Sometimes you just need to deal with it and embrace it. But anyway, so when you sit for long periods of time trying to learn complex things, what happens, and by the way, I heard this from David Goggins, Navy SEAL. He wrote this book called Can't Hurt Me, and he is just an overall badass. And one of the things he always says is that the mind has the tactical advantage. The mind has the tactical advantage. So what does that mean? It means that basically, to once again tie it back to the example I was just saying, when you're sitting for long periods of time trying to learn complex things, that's your strategy. Strategically, that's what you're doing. Strategy is long-term, tactics are short-term. And by the way, the strategist always prevails over the tactician. That's why Sun Tzu in The Art of War, which I have a little copy of right here, that's why he says that tactics are the noise before defeat, and strategy is the slowest road to victory. And obviously the master can combine tactics and strategy to work together to achieve the most efficient victory possible. But what the mind, when I say that, or when David Goggins says that the mind has the tactical advantage, what it means is that your mind is a very reactive biological tool, or at least some aspects of it, right? You have an amygdala, you have a neocortex, and you have a cortex. I believe that those are the three parts of the brain. And there are other little detailed parts like the hypothalamus or whatever it's called. And basically, so the rational part is in the neocortex. Emotions and things like that are in the cortex. Survival, quick reflexes, fight or flight, and all that are in the amygdala. So the mind has the tactical advantage because when you're trying to learn, right, and you're sitting there for long periods of time, you're using your neocortex primarily. So the rational and kind of analytical part of the brain, and that takes a lot of energy, and it's tough to sustain it, especially if you're not trained. Once again, that's where the skill comes in. And by the way, you can really train it to be extremely powerful. But if you're not used to it, then it can be tough. And then the other thing is that the emotional brain and the amygdala, if you don't regulate it, then it can basically cause emotional ups and downs throughout the day while you're trying to focus, which ultimately distracts you. So an example would be if you're sitting and you're trying to study something complex, and then all of a sudden your mind wanders off and you start thinking about a date that you have coming up or some other kind of thing like that. So a date is a perfect example because it's so, mating in relationships has to do with the amygdala and the cortex, which stimulate all kinds of hormones in your brain. If you're dwelling on a date, then your heart's probably pounding a little bit at the thought of it, and what am I going to do? Maybe you got a little bit of insecurity, so a little bit of cortisol hormones in your body start to flare up, and all these little hormones and things like that, they're tactically advantageous because they distract you from what you're doing. And that's why it is said that the mind has the tactical advantage, because if you're not careful, you can easily get caught up in the fluctuations of the mind rather than the strategic objective, which is to learn the programming language at hand, which, if you're not skilled at learning, is tough to do because it's boring, it's dry, or at least it can be if you're not, once again, skilled to do it. So that's really all I wanted to talk about, was how to address this issue. And what a lot of people will do, especially in Silicon Valley and things like this, is that they'll take smart drugs or they'll take Adderall. A lot of college students do this because their attention is so used to being distracted because they're constantly on their phones, and they don't know how to control their focus. They haven't developed their focus really well, and they're constantly getting distracted, so they're conditioned to not be able to focus for long periods of time. So that's why when I set my schedule to do something, I block the time out and I shut my phone off. In fact, I'll give you guys a little secret. I have a flip phone that I use for emergency contacts only, which stays on but cannot distract me really. And only like a couple of people have that number just in case something happens and they need me. But otherwise, everything else is on silence, everything else is on airplane mode, and that way every single day is an opportunity to hone and sharpen my attention so that I can really hone it in on whatever my mission happens to be at the time. And at the same time, I'm also always thinking of new ways to make studying more fun, more engaging, and more compelling. But the truth of the matter is that that's a skill that takes time, so you have to have patience. And the other thing is that mastering a skill, mastering a craft, it takes a lot of time before it becomes really rewarding. If you want to be a martial artist, top level black belt, and have the glory and have the fun of just knowing that you're that skilled at something, you're gonna have to go through a lot of times where you're the one getting choked out essentially, and you're the one getting beaten down and all that kind of stuff, and you're the one tapping out in the ring. That's why jiu-jitsu is such a great teacher, and why I believe Aristotle, or was it Plato, one of those philosophers said that wrestling is an essential for every young man to engage in. And I guess even women can do that too. So that was pretty much my piece. You're going to have to delay gratification if you want to get great at something. There's nothing wrong with it. Just make it fun for yourself. Give yourself a reward for doing well and for putting in the hours every day, because sometimes it can feel kind of like you're just slogging through the mud. But learn how to give yourself a reward, and keep the why in mind. Keep your mission in mind. Keep the strategy in mind, why you're doing all this, and eventually it will pay off. So don't quit, because winners don't quit and quitters don't win. Peace.